So when it got to be this weird faith over fear became what people used to not mask, I was saying, hold up, that's not at all what I think Jesus would do. On the Facebook page, I saw people see systemic racism and structural violence. The Capitol riot happened, and I talked about that, and that post went extremely viral for good and bad ways. We got threats at my house in the mailbox against my children from people who I went to church with. So when it became very home, when it became too near and too much, that's when I pulled back and, really had to decide if I'm going to continue speaking against this. It will be a cost.
Well, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. This is Dr. Tom Rundell, your curator of conversations. And these conversations around here, we rotate around something called liminal space. And that liminal space is the in-between place where you're neither here nor there, where you're in between, where you've left something behind and you haven't yet reached your destination in front of you. You're wandering in liminal space. And that can look really different for a lot of people. And my guest today, Dr. Emily Smith, she is very understanding of liminal space for a really unique reason. She is an epidemiologist and an assistant professor at the Department of Emergency Medicine at Duke University. And she became known as the friendly neighbor epidemiologist through her social media feeds during the pandemic of 2020 to 2021. And some of her posts went viral in good and bad ways, reaching 10 million people. And she has written a book about that experience called The Science of the Good Samaritan. And it kind of chronicles her journey to becoming an epidemiologist, her journey into then trying to become a good neighbor, a good Samaritan to people on the fringes, and having conversations around systemic racism, structural violence, having conversations during the pandemic about vaccinating and masking and being safe. And that led to a lot of difficult conversations in her own faith community because she's also married to a pastor in an evangelical church. And they did have to leave their church. And we talk about the liminal space of losing your community when you're speaking your voice authentically. And it was a wonderful conversation. We start off nerding out about astronomy, and we end up in the book of John talking about the resurrection. And so without further ado, I'm going to let you loose on this conversation I had with Dr. Emily Smith. Well, Dr. Emily Smith, welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. It's such a joy to have you on today.
Well, thanks for having me here. This should be fun. I love the name of it too, the liminal space, and that's very good.
What do you connect about the title liminal living in that space?
Well, and I don't want to jump into the book just straight off the bat, but the middle of the book is my liminal space. Mm-hmm. And I actually, I got very sick during that time. And so I just started painting, and I painted a picture, and it's just one very simple strip of green paint. And I have it hanging in the house. And my kids were like, "What is that?" I said, "That's liminal space. We're just going to live in the in-between time." So I think it's very fitting to talk about the book here.
Oh, that is cool. And it's so great to not have to explain what liminal is because
Sure.
It's not like a well-known term to a lot of people, or it's too broadly, there's so many different disciplines it applies to that people are like, wait, what are you talking about?
Yes, I get asked that when people look at the painting, because it's the first thing you see when you come in my house.
Oh, nice.
And I needed it as an anchor when I see it, but then to explain it to people, it takes some time.
Yeah, well, we were kind of connected in the little pre-show connection here that we kind of have a mutual love of astronomy. Did I get that? Did I hear correctly?
I don't know if it's astronomy or space. I went to a NASA space camp. One time I snuck in there somehow I think that was early college. And I just loved it. I don't know what it was. I think it was the engineer and the math and the spreadsheets and the science, the awe of getting out there. So I guess that's my love of all things space.
I really like how mind-blowing it becomes when you start thinking about I'm not a numbers person, but I know big numbers when I see them. And
sure,
you start hearing like the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second. And you think, wow, that's really fast. And then you zoom out and then you think it takes the sun, the light from the sun, it takes like 8 minutes and 13 seconds to get here. And then your mind starts exploding, and that's just right within our own place. So I love when things kind of blow up my brain a little bit. Astronomy does that for me.
Yeah, maybe that's why. Thank you for the therapy session. Maybe that's why I like it so much, because I work in quantitative data, factual. You can kind of button it up. You certainly can't with the problems, but you can with the data. But with space, it seems like you could get someplace that would blow your mind through math and then just be able to be in awe. Maybe that's why I like it.
Yeah, it definitely causes some amazement in me when I just start thinking about how large it all is, and it's how small we are in the midst of it all. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah.
So you are very science-minded because you are an epidemiologist. So can you kind of help us understand, what does an epidemiologist do?
Yes, and it's a 7-syllable word. So if you need to throw it in, like at the Christmas table with uncles or aunts, then go for it, because it sounds really big. Before the pandemic, people thought we were skin doctors or bug people, like entomology. I'd get that a lot.
Yeah.
Or an epidermis with the skin. And so it really wasn't until COVID that people at least heard epidemiology for the first time. The technical term it's the branch of science that is the distribution and determinants of disease. And so what makes a disease spread and who is most at risk of it. It is certainly the disease detectives that you see on Jack Ryan movies, where they have to go in. I have friends that do that type of work, which is just very cool. I do a little bit of a different type of epi, which I know we'll get into. But for me, it's a health equity science, because when you look at diseases always hit on the margins, and they always hit with poverty. And I mean, really, it's the poorest of the poor or the margins of the margins that get hit the most. So that's why I call it a health equity science. But that's what I do. I'm here at Duke teaching and doing research at the Global Health Institute.
Oh, that is amazing. Now, what kind of soil did your life grow out of that sent you in this direction to pursue epidemiology?
Yes, and I talk a little bit about this in the book. It's a bit memoir-ish. It's certainly not a tell-all memoir, but it goes back to that story. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were worship leaders at a charismatic church, and we were the home where the missionaries would stay when they would come, either to talk with the church or on furlough. And I just remember asking them questions. I mean, 6, 7, 8 years old, just being enamored with their adventures and their travels. And that's one of my first memories, is I just wanted to be a missionary or something global. When you fast forward to high school, I still loved science. I grew up in a really, really tiny town. And so I was very fortunate to have a very good science teacher who talked about DNA one day. This is going to be really nerd central. And this is like 9th grade. And I went up to him after class and just told him, I think that's the best thing I've ever heard, something to that extent, because I can get a little excited about stuff. So he handed me a book on human genetics. It was a college textbook, but I didn't know. And I read it and thought, well, I'll just go to medical school. I really didn't know what else to do if I wanted to do missionary work, then becoming a medical doctor or a dentist or something, which I knew I didn't want to do. So I was pre-med during undergrad. And then I went to my first overseas trip to Honduras with the Mercy Ship. And that's I didn't know it at the time, but I noticed epidemiology then because I realized I wasn't necessarily excited about helping one-on-one people. I was more interested in why couldn't they afford to get to care earlier? Or why weren't there systems and policies already in place to help? Or why isn't there a whole hospital here? And that's epidemiology, that's population questions instead of individual. So it was kind of serendipity of where I got in to that. I came home and was going to go to medical school and had a gap year. So, like a good nerd, I got another degree during that gap year, and it was public health. And day one of epidemiology, my professor said, here's the technical definition of epi. And then he started talking about the equity part. And as a Christian, it hit me that that's the science of the Good Samaritan. It's quantifying who's most at need and then choosing not to walk by. And I've just been hooked ever since.
Yeah, your book outline, I like you say it's kind of memoirish, and it makes something a little bit hard to grasp for a lot of people, public health and epidemiology, and you put story to it, but then you bring along, this biblical parable of the Good Samaritan, and you tie those two things together really well. And
thank you.
I really did enjoy like the flow of the book and how it developed. It helped. I really didn't know anything about epidemiology until, as you said, the pandemic. And then all of a sudden that became a word, and I'm listening to podcasts with virologists and epidemiologists, and it's like, I need to understand this. But
yeah.
You say something interesting, that it's an empathetic epidemiologist, where you're really tying it to the public good and public health and why don't people have access. And if I were to look at it and just by definition, it's like you're crunching numbers and adding data, but you add this empathetic piece to it. How do you blend like this science approach that is all about data, crunching numbers and finding solutions with this really personal, empathetic piece that you've been able to land in?
Well, thank you for saying that too about the book, because I didn't want it to be too sciencey where it's inaccessible, but it's also not just a devotional type, which is fine to go either way, but I just wanted to blend it. So I'm glad at least it kind of worked for when you read it. With me, the data that we get, we deal with a lot of data, like millions of data points on lots and lots of people. Especially, I do some work in countries like Somaliland and Burundi. So there's, it's 13 people at a time to a couple of thousand. But then I also do these large population studies of just all countries. So that's millions. I think to get to the empathy part is if we ask the wrong question, or if we analyze that data wrong, or if what we're analyzing isn't actually getting to the right question, that translates into policy. A lot of what I do is I try to give policymakers or the WHO or the CDC, here's who is most at risk of poverty and children's cancer. I'll give you an example of what I do. If I get that wrong because we have the wrong data, that means that the interventions after that will be implemented wrong. It's not going to get to the margins if we don't have the right people in there. So I think the empathy piece for me comes in on that of each data point is a person, is a story, is a family. They have a history. They have a kids they want to feed. I guess an example of the children's cancer, I'm working in Tanzania right now, of children who make it to care to receive chemotherapy. And most of them come way too late. And that's of no fault of their own. These families are extremely poor and they're impoverished just trying to pay for lodging and food and transportation to get there. Once they get to the hospital, the care is free, but they have to make it there. And so recognizing that story within the data, it changes you, I think, to be more empathetic, not only to the problem, but to the people itself. And then it also makes me think, who isn't there? I'm going to get to talk to the families of the children who get to care, but it's the tip of the iceberg of kiddos who actually need care in Tanzania who will never get to the hospital. So I think the empathy just comes with recognizing people's story and what they bring and hold when they come into the hospital, but also the countries. We might get to talking about that from a systemic standpoint, but empathy towards countries too, I think, is really important to be a Good Samaritan.
Yeah, you really did a good job of noticing the imbalance in the scales of global healthcare. And then you trace its history through like modern colonial projects, and then you share concrete data that illustrates this. And then you tie it all back to the story of the Good Samaritan. Can you share some data that was impactful to your outlook on this topic and how it ties back to the story of that Good Samaritan?
Yes, and these will be for people who love history like me, of informing. I'm a huge reader, so this will be really, that part specifically will be interesting for people like that. I work in a country called Somaliland, which technically is part of Somalia. It's in the Horn of Africa. North of it is Yemen, just for geography for people. It's also the fourth poorest country in the world, with some of the highest indicators of poor health, like moms and babies dying. Even when you compare it to neighboring Ethiopia or even Yemen, it blows those out of the water in terms of health needs. And I think if you don't look at the history of that place, I think it's easy for people in America or even in Western societies to kind of shame that country. That it's their fault. I'm using air quotes on, it's their fault that they are where they are. What I do in the book, though, is I go back to 1885. And if you look within the documents, there is this historic meeting between 14 countries. All are high income, all are white men around this horseshoe table. And at the end of that table is this massive picture of Africa on the wall. If you haven't Googled that picture, then Google it just to get a visual. But those 14 men at the end of that meeting, the whole point was to splice and dice the continent of Africa for colonialism. Who was going to get what part of the continent, basically? No one from Africa was there. The Sultan of Zanzibar actually asked to come and was denied entry. Only 2 of those men had actually been in the continent. So if you look at a map of Africa before that meeting and then after that meeting, it looks like someone literally drew a pencil just down Lake Victoria or some other portions. And what that did is it split about 10% of the traditional ethnic, the groups, the countries that were already organically in place, even the systems of royalty or who was in charge within the country organically. When you fast forward to nowadays, the countries that were split up or that were colonized the worst, like colonization, colonialism was brutal and awful. It's certainly not the Good Samaritan. But when you look at places like the Congo, what Belgium did there with King Leopold, there's a whole book on that if you want to, King Leopold's Ghost, which is an excellent book, but also heartbreaking. The countries that were split the most or colonized the worst have some of the highest child health mortality rates and the mother mortality rates, also the instability. I bring that up with Somaliland because Somaliland was one of those countries. And so when we are thinking about these health outcomes or poverty or impoverishment, even here in the States, sometimes you'll hear from Western people, they should just get a job, or it's of their own fault that war is happening. There's so much shaming. And that might be true to some extent, but I think when you look systemically at these problems, it's of a lot of fault, not of even of their own making. So I think it helps us bring, again, empathy and compassion to the reality of their situations across the world.
Yeah. One of my favorite people of all time, Thomas Merton, he wrote a book called Faith and Violence that it like utterly transformed the way I see the world, really. And he outlines what's called white collar violence, which that meeting at the table that you just described, he would have pegged that one in that book as white collar violence. They're not necessarily out there with a gun or a knife or, doing the actual killing. So nobody is going to fault them in that regard, like we would, if you encountered a mugger in, an alleyway. But he says there's more evil done in the world through this white collar violence than there is these muggings in the streets. And it just really, growing up near Detroit, I would watch Cops, that show Cops. And there is a unbalanced representation of the good guys and the bad guys. The good guys are always white cops and the bad guys are always inner city black men or women. And that shapes your way of thinking of things.
Right.
And then I read this book, Faith and Violence, and it really, I guess it just opened up a whole new way of looking at what I would consider violence.
Right. And I had the chapter specifically about that called structural violence and singing.
Yeah.
When I had my second child, he came a month early and it was very quick and very scary because I was hit with severe preeclampsia. I didn't have any of the risk factors either. So it came out of nowhere. And we were in the hospital multiple times after that with very high blood pressure. He was really sick. But we had the money to be able to go to the hospital. We had insurance. It was very close to my home. I had a car. But then, the book, I go to another place where I work, which is Burundi. It's a landlocked country. It also has a lot of history with the Great Scramble story that I just told. But there you see mothers, the same equivalence of a young mom who is having her second baby. Preeclampsia hits her. She has to walk to healthcare, but there's no diagnostic capabilities at that facility for preeclampsia. Preeclampsia, if it is not treated, has a really high fatality rate. And so it's her and her child's outcome is dependent on structures around her or not around her. So that's structural violence. That's violence impeded onto families or mothers and children that are really of no fault of their own. It's the structure surrounding them, including poverty. Mm-hmm. So I think that gets right into your Thomas Merton example of, there is this individual violence, but also one just of poverty and systemic racism too here in the States, like you talk about.
Yeah. I actually have one of your quotes here from the book. It says, if we pull back the curtain of people's stories and lives, we begin to see the ominous threads of these violent structures. We see the marginalized communities lacking access to timely health care or the ability to build generational wealth, not as their own fault, but rather as the result of the history in that community. And you really, I never heard the history of that horseshoe table meeting at all. I've seen, data that says that, Africa is one of the richest in what do they call that? Like the elements and the richest continents on earth. But, it was this meeting that they went in to get those things to exploit them. And now they don't have that generational wealth. They're not a part of the global community, which is the richest nations of the world are called that. And so I think your book kind of spells that out really, really well.
Yeah. And then it even brings it to home. I'm here in Durham, North Carolina, and I looked at the history of neighborhoods around here during the redlining time.
Yeah.
And that's when neighborhoods I didn't know a lot about that either until I started really researching it a couple of years ago. But that's where neighborhoods were systematically not given home loans, or their home value was pulled down tremendously just because it was a Black neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Even though those laws are gone, like the segregation against the neighborhood, nowadays those neighborhoods have home values that are $40,000 to $60,000 less than the white neighborhoods, and they look the same. Everything's the same. The trees and square footage. So when you think about generational wealth, that also has an impact that way. And I just think it helps us be better neighbors when we understand that, and also understand our own privilege, to acknowledge it, not to be buffed by hearing about it, but to just recognize it.
Yeah, I actually, I was listening to the podcast Black history for white people.
Yeah.
And that helps me get a better understanding of it. And they told a story of a family that was going to do a test, and they had it was a black family. They had all of their pictures in their home, which was in not in a quote, black neighborhood. It was just a neighborhood. And they had an appraiser come through and appraise, and it came back lower than they expected. Then they got a second appraiser, and they switched out all the photos with white people, and it came back much higher. And just that understanding there, and they were able to replicate this test over and over again in other homes. That it's just, there's that history of systemic racism. Even if we say, okay, now this is not against, now this is against the law, the red line has been removed, we haven't fixed what was harmed before that happened.
Right, or because of it.
Or because of it, yes. And there seems to be like this tension in conservative communities where we have a hard time balancing like personal freedoms with social responsibilities. And I think this really came out during the pandemic. It became a very polarized issue, personal freedoms versus, social responsibilities. Why do you think in a religion like Christianity that has this Good Samaritan story as one of the heart parables, why do we have a hard time balancing personal freedoms with social responsibility if the heart of us is supposed to be this Good Samaritan story?
That is such a good, I don't know. That's a great question. I think some of it is because we grow up in an individualistic society. We are surrounded by pull yourself up by your bootstraps type thing and go for the gold, make your own story. I just think that can get in your soul when you grow up in it, the capitalistic type of, and I'm very grateful for some things here in America. So I want to preface that because every time I say something like that, I get a lot of pushback. So I think some of that is the individualistic. I also think that it is seeped into churches. I've grown up in the church, and I've been a pastor's wife now for 20 years in evangelical churches. And so I understand the beauty of that, but also the discipleship that happens or that maybe doesn't happen. When you talk about money within evangelical churches, it's a lot about stewardship and taking care of our own families and honoring that. And all of that is lovely and good. There isn't a lot about sell your possessions and give it to the poor. And I think and also of doing both of that is what we're missing. If you read the book, I hope that you see the and also all throughout. It is being a good neighbor, like giving at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and also how do we spend the rest of our money? So I think it's a mix of that. Maybe, I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts, church and just living in an individualistic society.
Yeah, I do think that evangelicalism is hyper individualistic because, the language we use is my personal relationship with Jesus, a personal Lord and Savior. Everything is a personal something, and we've lost a big communal aspect to that. And I think that is a response to the hyper individualized way of living that we are. We're always going to be speaking the language of the culture we're in. And I think it's probably the result of being in a hyper individualistic capitalistic society. And it's really hard, I think, for Christians to separate their faith and what is required of them of their faith with the culture that's around them. And then we end up blending the two.
Right.
And you wrote in your book, you said the pull of today's Western world is fraught with wealth and capitalism and the pursuit of individualistic code words like life, liberty, and happiness. The way of Jesus in the Good Samaritan story challenges that code and redefines ambition according to compassion and obedience to a cross, not fame or selfish pursuit or wealth. And I guess I'll turn the question back onto you. Why? Because in light of that quote there, why would you think it's so difficult for American Christians to not only untangle their faith from American individualistic capitalism, but to see it as something that's different altogether?
Yeah, for sure. I think, and all of us do this, whatever we grow up with or wherever we are, the gut reaction is to think that everybody else is too. And, if you have a car, everybody else in the world does. If you have insurance, everybody else in the world does or has something like it. And so I think, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book was, during the pandemic, when I inadvertently went viral, it was because I was writing about these issues of faith, liberty. What does it mean to have freedoms? As an epidemiologist, I started that page just to help people understand the science, And then as a pastor's wife and a church person, and as a good Samaritan, with what my job is in the world, I wrote from those lenses. So when it got to be this weird faith over fear became what people used to not mask, I was saying, hold up, that's not at all what I think Jesus would do. And that was coming from the Evangelical church. So I think, again, it's an issue of discipleship, of what we have learned or been told. When we hold on to the good old days, like the freedoms of always having the 10 Commandments somewhere, or see you at the poll rallies and praying before football. I grew up in New Mexico, eastern New Mexico, which is a lot like Texas, where that was just every Friday night was prayer, but only prayer that was to the Christian God. And I had friends where I remember just feeling very uncomfortable sometimes that they were not, and there wasn't a place really for them at those. So I think for people to realize the world is not centered around what we think it is, because it looks like what it does outside of our window. When you're open to understanding that that isn't the rest of the world, I think that's a really good place to be. And I saw that, on the Facebook page, I saw people see systemic racism and structural violence. George Floyd was murdered, and I talked about that from a public health, but also from a neighbor perspective. The Capitol riot happened, and I talked about that, and that post went extremely viral for good and bad ways. I did have a group of people who said, okay, I've been a Christian all my life, but I've never seen this before, but I want to be different. There was another group on the page that dug in to the good old days, or the non-masking for faith over fear, even harder, and came after me. The book is written in response to the people who said, I want to be different. I see it now. I understand, even though my church isn't acknowledging it, I want to do something different. So it's for that crowd where let's go and talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that was the right move and not a rebuttal against, No,
I didn't have the stomach for the rebuttal against the other group. We got threats at my house, in the mailbox, against my children, from people who I went to church with. So when it became very home, when it became too near and too much, that's when I pulled back and, really had to decide, if I'm going to continue speaking against this, it will be a cost. But who am I speaking to? And if I'm being honest, I don't really have the stomach to yell anymore to the, I will speak truth, but I will do it towards something instead of against a group.
Well, I think that's the healthier response. It's for your own sanity, at least.
Yes, I hope so.
Now, you did write that you had to leave your church community, and how painful and disorienting that was for you. But also it brought that gift of, I think I'll sum it up with a snarky authenticity. Can you kind of tell us the story of, why you had to end up leaving your church community?
Yeah. And that, the book has three sections. And the middle section is that cost section. It is the shortest out of all. It's only 2 chapters, because I think that's all I could put in there at the time. It is by far the most personal and vulnerable too, because I didn't want this this book to be a tell-all for sure. But I wanted it to be authentic, and I wanted people to know, like, when you start living like a good neighbor, when you start talking about health equity or really trying to live like I want to be a heaven on earth type of person, it could cost you something, especially depending on the community that surrounds you. And when I was doing this Facebook page and the threats were coming, we were in Texas at the time. We were in the middle of the evangelical culture, like the heart of it. And it cost because of my husband's job, but also because of what I was saying on Facebook and that was going viral was kind of opposite of what we were living. And so it just became untenable physically and emotionally, spiritually. And we just had to make a decision to leave that church, also for the sake of kiddos. I mean, if you read those chapters, they by far are the messiest. They still feel messy. When I recorded the audiobook, I thought, gosh, there's some of these sentences I needed to work on harder because they felt messy. But also I wonder if it needed to just stay messy so it felt real and authentic to people that read it. On the flip side of that, the third part of the book is about courage. So it's once you've lived like a neighbor, once you've had the cost, which I hope that people don't have a cost as much as what mine was, there is courage, I think, to live who we were meant to be, at least who I was meant to be. You know, I am not a fighter. I've always been a peacemaker, been a little bit quieter than other people. And so I'm not the first to run to a fight, nor to ask and egg it on. That's just not who I am. But I found that living like a neighbor, I actually had more courage in me than what I thought to say and to be who I think Jesus has made me to be in this world. And I just wanted people to know that, maybe as an encouragement, that you have it in you to be a neighbor, even if it is going to cost, and even if you can't see who you're going to be on the other side. And so now I feel like I'm just fully known, fully exposed, and fully vulnerable of probably everything I think about the world, but also very fully alive. And I don't know how to express that. I don't think I got that out enough in the courage section. Maybe that's book 2. I don't know. But I'm very grateful for the hardships of that now. Not all of the hardships, because it's still super raw, especially against the stuff that was against my kids. But I do think it's made me more authentic now.
Yeah. And there is that large evangelical machine, we can call it. I've noticed, I talk with a lot of pastors, I coach a lot of pastors, spiritual director, and a lot of them they think things, they feel things very strongly, but then they'll say, but I could never say that to my church. And I'll say, why is that?
Right.
Oh, they'll fire me. And there is like this demand for conformity within the machine that we call evangelicalism, that, you know, if we want this machine to keep moving and be smooth, then we're not allowed to have these questions and these naysayers and these beliefs, and these people are not welcome. And it keeps the machine streamlined and running smooth, and contributes to the, you know, the butts in the seats and the budget increasing.
Yeah.
And so it, you know, air quotes, works, but it doesn't really work, because, as you're telling me, there's a suppression of voices, a suppression of authenticity that a friend of mine just texted me yesterday. He said, I went to an Episcopalian church for the first time ever. Never done that before, but I just felt so like welcomed. And while I would have went to these other church plants with all these programs, and they'd say they're welcoming, they're not really welcoming. And I texted them back. I said, yes, you're welcome to come and conform to who we are, is what they mean by that phrase. Do you notice that as well in that machine, being a pastor, growing up within the pastoral realm?
Yes. And I also have so much compassion for pastors out there. Because there are some that in the evangelical space that are just blowing, going straight through whatever they think. But the ones that really have a heart towards empathy, and they would love to steer their ship differently and, shepherd the congregation away from maybe mainstream things they want to talk about racism. They want to talk about poverty. They want to talk about things that are, in the book, but they can't because like what you said, they'll get fired. I just have so much empathy towards that because I just get that. I mean, we still have lots and lots of friends within those situations too. And we were fortunate where we could make a decision. I mean, that's a privilege to be able to make a decision. Others can't because of the paychecks and the children to raise. And I understand that. I mean, you cannot leave, and I get that. If that's the case, I also wanted to write the book for those pastors where it's an accessible resource that you could do as like a Sunday school or a book club or a Wednesday night thing. And let's talk about systemic racism, and let me do the talking about it and tell you a really silly story about my grandparents, growing up at my grandparents' house in Oklahoma and in Texas. And then weaving in these stories. And so it doesn't feel as blunt. I think that's one option. I think the other is there probably are some pastors who are just about to make the decision to leave, and it's very hard. I mean, I felt like we lost, a foundation that we were building for 20 years, or that I had been building for 40 years before we left. And so I understand that. That's a very hard move to make. But if they are at the point where the move is ready to go, I just want to encourage that there is something on the other side for that, even despite the cost. I think this whole thing is messy. It's not one or the other, leave or stay, get up from the pulpit and just, say something that's going to get you fired unless you really feel like that's what the Holy Spirit wants you to do. I think it's going to be a slow turn and a conversation that people need to be ready to have. Yeah. So I do see that a whole lot. And we go to a more of a liturgical church. We joke that I grew up charismatic, we were in evangelical Baptist churches for 20 years, and now we go to a liturgical one. So I don't quite know when to stand and when to sit. And I might just yell glory for the charismatic roots. But I do find it refreshing to have that space to be a little quieter now, ask these questions, and it'd be okay to ask. And also very like-minded people.
Yeah. There's since you're a history nerd, I'm a little history nerd as well, on certain topics. There was this fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Church. Yes. in its leadership that happened, within this generation. But one of the side effects of that takeover is that they held a lot of the publishing houses that put out Bible study material. And so one of the connections that I've been able to make, thanks to the Holy Post podcast, is most pastors in America are evangelical, and they pastor a congregation that's fundamentalist because they've been discipled by all these books and resources that have come out of the fundamentalist presses. Yeah. And so the church, we haven't felt comfortable challenging those things. And now it's come to that place where the tail is wagging the dog. And pastors today are so limited in how they can disciple their churches and congregations because there's only so much they can say or so much they can be vulnerable about or with. And that's why there's this great resignation of pastors happening across the Western world right now, is that there's just burnt out of it all, I think.
And I don't blame any of that. I think that is a hard job to be a pastor, especially right now, and to be in ministry and to be trying to do your best and want to have these conversations. It's really hard.
Yeah. And it is a challenging space to occupy. I've personally landed in a church that is kind of more mainline Protestant, and we're covenantal instead of creedal. So it's like there's some space here to actually have conversations about stuff. We're supposed to be a diverse group, so we will have lots of different viewpoints on one thing in the same room. But since we're covenantal, we have to agree to be in covenant with one another and be okay with other viewpoints in the room with us. And that can be a little bit challenging, but it's also gives me the freedom to actually say things that I think need to be said as well. So
yeah,
it's a good spot. Now, you've written a lot about how gardening was a good practice for you and how healing it was. What was it about that practice of gardening that was so centering for you and healing?
Well, it was one of the first things that I could do after we got so much pushback and threats, and this is online stuff too. You get enough pictures of guns sent to you, and that little T trauma accumulates. And so I just got really, really sick, and my body just said no more. It was keeping a score, and then I was losing. So there was a good 15 months where I was either home or pretty much bedbound. I mean, it was just awful. I go into that a little bit of the book. And one of the things that I lost was being able to garden. I've always loved the outside and nature and getting out there and getting dirty, just messing with whatever, the vegetable garden. And then I couldn't go out there to be able to take care of the garden because I got so sick. And I couldn't even really look at it because I needed complete darkness. Like the sunlight would trigger my migraines and my body just going crazy. So once I could finally go back out in the garden, that was right around summertime. And my garden had exploded without me being out there to take care of it. And the kids would go out there and my husband would go out there kind of, but they're not the gardeners, they're not going to like talk to the plants and love on them like I would. But when I looked at it, it had exploded. And it was such a gift to me of, being taken care of, even in the midst of not being able to take care of it myself. And I mean, it was like flowers that were coming out from bulbs that I planted months and months ago. So that was one of those issues, but also being able to get in the dirt and cry into it and just get angry and have a space to be able to do that without it being verbal, because I was afraid of what I would say verbally or write, on the internet or say to people if I let out those emotions. So the garden became a spot where I could just do that and cry into the soil. In a very tender moment, though, it was also one of those times where I remember looking at the garden when I could finally get back out there and just kind of look at it and piddle, but I couldn't physically do a whole lot. And I just remembered that story of after Jesus died, and when Mary went back to go recover the body, or she thought she was going to go do that, and the body wasn't there. And I just can't imagine the devastation upon devastation of not being able to do it. And then someone starts talking to her, and she thinks it's the gardener. A lot of you Bible people will know this story. And so he says, like, what's wrong? And she's, says they've taken away the body and I don't know where to find it. And when she says, I hope I'm getting that story right. I'm probably butchering the truth, like whatever the NIV says, but that's the essence.
You are on point. Keep going.
And he says her name, and it makes me teary every time because then she recognizes it's him. And to me, the identity of that moment, of like, I will still tenderly say your name. And not only that, I'm going to show you that I'm still here, happened in a moment where she thought it was the gardener. And that kind of happened for me too. I just remember thinking, I've lost everything. We've lost church. We've lost a foundation of faith. I didn't lose my faith, but I lost what I thought it was going to look like. And then physically, I lost what I thought I would look like. And just that moment of, I don't know if I'm ever going to get back there. To hear who you think is a gardener call your name in the midst of a gardener was pretty powerful to me. It was almost like this moment of not being told that all of that's going to be redeemed, but being told that the rest is going to be okay. And I see that now as fruit. We're in a new community. I am so much more me than I've ever been. I just didn't see it at the time. It's nice to be called Emily within the garden space. And now I can get out there. I'm much better. I'm not fully 100%, but I can garden again. And I just remember that most of the times when I go out. I also hung these lights that are solar powered. And so when I go out, when it's dark, that is the only light in there. And I'll go out at night too. And just, if whatever I need to say or whatever I need to do, I kind of get it out in gardening.
I love that. The picture you painted of you gardening and kind of almost meeting Jesus again in that moment. And for Mary, that was the same, where she's meeting God again. And then we're supposed to, I had this picture of Adam and Eve, and they're in a garden and God's looking for them, calling their name. And now here we have another garden, and it's almost like Jesus is going to say, and we're going to start fresh, let's start over. And
call you by your true name.
Yeah.
I think for Mary and for me. Yeah, go ahead. I interrupted you.
No, you added that piece that needed to be added, where we're going to start fresh, but with your true name.
Right.
And your authentic self. And that sounds like where you've landed with this new community and, somewhat of a being healed and better enough to garden and to write and to be on the other side of those things, almost like you had everything torn down and taken away, but you found the gift of who you are, and now you're moving forward with rebuilding with that. And that story of the garden, I think, is just such a beautiful representation of that.
Yeah, it also reminded me, in the book talks about the garden, that courage section has the garden, but then it also has the table. So the other time that I love in the Bible where a garden is mentioned is in Revelation. And that is the fruit for the nations. There's an abundance. There's no scarcity when we're looking at Revelation chapter 21 of heaven on earth, of what's going to be restored. So I think it's the Bible starting with the garden and then ending with the garden, with trees and water. And then in that middle, there's that in between, maybe there's that liminal time, right? That liminal garden of Mary, but then also of me. So I think gardening also pointed me to corporate living and this living as a globe. Because when we see Revelation 21, there's no more poverty. There's no more tears. There's no more lack. There is a table of abundance. And so living as people for that table, in the book, it opens with a table and it ends with a table too. So I'm going to give a little bit of a teaser there. But that table is not one where we lack anymore. And I think living as Good Samaritan type people towards that table means that we live very differently corporately, and of baskets being multiplied from fishes and loaves type of people, of believing that that's who God is, but also believing that we as ambassadors have, jobs to do too, living towards that garden and towards that table. So the whole garden and table imagery has been very powerful for me now.
Yeah, I can see why. That's wonderful. Now, if you could give our listeners some action steps, because maybe they have values that don't mesh with their community's values, and but they're reading the Gospels in a different way with the Good Samaritan in mind. Are there some action steps for seeking equity, or maybe some sustaining practices that they could find? What comes to mind about either action steps or sustaining practices?
Yeah, in the very back of the book, I give a couple of super duper practical tips for families because with me, I've got 2 kids. How do you raise good neighbors? Basically, how do you raise people who will be the Good Samaritans? And that's like get a map on the fridge, uh, write on sticky notes. If you hear something in the news or my kids come home and they say, "Hey, I met somebody who just moved from Nigeria. We did this the other day." And I said, "Well, go look it up on the map. Where is it? And let's Google Earth it and walk through some of the streets." I think that's really powerful to make global minded kids. I think for adults, what you can do is read a lot and listen, probably listen more and read more than when we speak, because there's so much history and so much of the world that we don't know yet. In the back of the book, I put my top 10-ish books. The publisher asked for top 10 and I couldn't do it. So it's 10-ish. I think that's a good start too. And then the first section is that whole section on how do we center our lives correctly around the Good Samaritan story. And that's just going to take some time. So I feel like that's a non-answer of read a lot more, figure out who you want to be as an individual and as a family. And then if you need to make hard decisions about a new community we moved communities and we moved states. Hopefully it's not that dramatic, but those hard decisions, if they're predicated on a foundation of who you want to be or who you want your kids to be, it's a little bit easier to make those. So I would say read a lot, listen a lot.
I think that is a wonderful practice to have. So, well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Where would you like to direct people who would be interested in connecting with you or buying your book?
Thank you. Well, the book can be bought anywhere you love to buy books. I read the audiobook, and I guarantee it is full of voice inflections and excitement because I just can't help it. I tear up multiple times too. So if you like audiobooks, you can do that and find it. I'm on all the socials, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram as Friendly Neighbor Epidemiologist. I am mostly on Facebook and Instagram, a little bit on Twitter. And then I long form write through Substack, through emilysmith.substack.net. If you want more than just, a little Twitter thread or a Facebook thread, that's where you can find me. I do a Neighbor Tuesday every week of how do we live like a Good Samaritan neighbor in the world, depending on whatever's going on in the world. So people can sign up for that too.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I've loved this conversation.
Thank you for having me. This is excellent, and I really appreciated it.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Liminal Living Podcast and this conversation with Dr. Emily Smith. I hope you were able to pull something out of there about how to be a good neighbor, especially here with the launch of the new year and where we're headed. Hopefully you got a vision for some things that you can change in the upcoming year, and you got some practices and perspectives of how to process your life in your liminal space. If you did enjoy this episode, I ask that you would subscribe to it wherever you are listening. And if you would feel so comfortable and so kind, would you please share it with somebody? Maybe repost it in your socials or just send it in a text message to someone you think would benefit from this conversation. And also you could leave a review as long as they're nice and you're going to be a good neighbor about it, because I ain't got time for trolls. But you can leave a review and some stars wherever you're listening, and that helps people to find us. So we will see you next week for another conversation that I've curated for you, and I think you're gonna like it. Have a good week. Peace out.